G'day folks, this is Raymond Foster, hope you're doing great. Jimbo Jackson asks, how would you deal with an anti-white who says we need more empathy for Aboriginal historic victimhood and is grovelling and apologising on behalf of white people in a pathetic way? I wasn't sure the best angle to come at it. Okay. So, this is my general take in regards to this matter. When anybody, vague or anti-white, right, doesn't matter who it is, if they suggest, alright, or they promote, they say we need more empathy for Aboriginal historic victimhood, alright, my general statement to this would be fair enough, so long as it doesn't impede on white well-being. Okay? Which means it's fine to have sympathy and empathy for the historic victimhood of the Aboriginal people, the suffering that they went through, etc., so long as that isn't used as an excuse for anti-whiteism, racial discrimination against members of Western kind. So, how do we make this distinction? How do we know if a promotion for empathy and sympathy for the historic suffering of the Aboriginal people is actually compassion for Aboriginals, or is it just anti-whiteism, just an excuse to hate white folk? To use Aboriginals, a lack of compassion and empathy, just an excuse, a lie to use Aboriginals to hate white folk. This is how we can tell. When they speak about the victimisation, the suffering of Aboriginals, is there any blame of whites? If there's any blame on whites, it's just anti-whiteism, it's just an excuse to attack and hate white folk. Okay? Why? Because if it was actually compassion for the Aboriginal people and the historic suffering of the Aboriginal people, the blame would be on the individuals, the actual individuals, okay? Not whites as a whole, alright? Not the white race, but the actual individual human beings, the men and women, okay, regardless of their race or background, they would be blamed. The fact that the matter of their race is irrelevant. If the folk who caused the suffering of the Aboriginal people were or were not white, is irrelevant to the suffering of the Aboriginal people, which should be the focus, if there's actually compassion for the suffering of the Aboriginal people. But to use it as an excuse, and then to say, hey, look, the individuals who happen, some of these individuals who happen to be responsible, look at the colour of their skin. So that means you, who have the same colour of skin, you're responsible now. See, that's how you know it's just evil anti-whiteism. They don't actually care about Aboriginals. Because imagine if we did that in the reverse. A few Aboriginals have done really, really bad things to white folk. There's some really nasty Aboriginal folk out there. There's nasty people of all groups, all races. Alright, so it's a fact. There's been some in history, it's a historical fact in Australia. There's been some really evil, nasty Aboriginals who have mistreated and abused and harmed innocent white people. Even murdered them, raped and murdered them. Women and children. Okay? So, if there was any justification to blame whites for the suffering of Aboriginals, that means there would also be the exact same in the reverse, and we'd have to blame all Aboriginals for the rape of white children. All Aboriginals would be responsible for the rape of white children. Every single one alive today. If us white folk alive today are responsible because we happen to be white. You see, it doesn't work like that. Just because a couple of Aboriginals happen to rape and murder some white women and children, that doesn't make all Aboriginals responsible. But we can still focus on that suffering of those white women and children and have compassion for the suffering, the historical suffering of those white women and children, without having to put blame on an entire race of people. And in the exact same way, if you actually have compassion for Aboriginals, you can have compassion and empathy for the historic suffering of Aboriginals without also trying to use that as an excuse to put blame and hatred on an entire race of people. So there you go. That's how you address this matter. It's fine to have empathy and sympathy for the Aboriginals and their suffering, but it's wrong as soon as you start blaming whites in any way whatsoever. You can blame individual people who happen to be white, but if you bring up that they're white, or you make any, any significance, you're trying to make some important, or put importance to the matter that they are white, the fact that they are white, and then use that as an excuse to blame all white people in general, and promote racial hatred and racial discrimination, well then you're just an evil bigot. It's wrong. Okay? So again, you can blame individual people for the wrongs that they've done and have sympathy and compassion for the suffering of the victims that they've harmed, but you don't have to bring up their race. Okay? The race of the perpetrators is irrelevant. What we need to focus on is the suffering of the victims. Take it easy.